Hello and good evening, everyone. I am excited to talk about this, and I've been busy doing other things. And so I thought I would take a break from my house cleaning mission and discuss a little bit more about what I told you guys that I am going to be working on regarding the original timeline that I had, that I am correcting, revising, clarifying, extending, all of that, and let you guys know a little bit more in detail about what my thought process is and where I'm going to be taking it and how the scriptures fit together. I actually don't have my Bible down here with me, but I probably don't need it to just discuss this. So when I had gone through the final Jubilee research, the final Jubilee year, that was the original timeline that I did in part 5 of my first book, which I released back in December of 2016. So it's been over the course of the past few years I have been writing. But that first book, it had 5 parts. The first part was the Battle of Gog and Magog. It was an end times timeline, a journey through the end of days, like what it starts with and what it ends with. And then the whole 70th week and everything about that. It was like a comprehensive study. So part 1 was the Battle of Gog and Magog. I went verse by verse through Ezekiel 38 and 39. And part 2 was the Daniel 9:27 covenant, where I broke down parts A, the beginning of the week, part B, the middle of the week, and part C, the end of the week, Daniel 9:27. Part 3 was the first time that I put into writing the different ways in which the 7 feasts of the Lord pointed to Christ and how they found their fulfillment in the person of Jesus Christ. Part 4 was the actual day of the Lord. Sorry. In my cleaning, I have a ceiling fan at the top of my stairs, and I broke a blade on it when I was cleaning around it. And then I tried to use it after that to see if it would still work, and it hit the wall and broke a second blade. So I was like, help, I need the name of someone who can install one for me, because the stores won't install past like 10 feet high, and it's obviously higher than 10 feet. So I just got a name of a person. Anyway, sorry. My mother was sending me the name of a handyman who can install it for me. So anyway, part 4 of the End Times Timeline, A Journey Through the End of Days, was going through the day of the Lord, the events that will happen at the time that Jesus comes back, the specific day of the Lord, and the fulfillment of the 6 purposes of the 70 weeks and all of that, how they will all find fulfillment at or by that point that Jesus comes back. The last of which finds its fulfillment in Ezekiel 43, which will be revisited in this next book. And then part 5 was the final Jubilee year. What year could all of this happen in, the second coming? So there is a prophecy in the key scriptures here are really, and where I started with the final Jubilee research and kind of worked backwards to incorporate some other things that fall on the timeline, because it is a timeline of Jubilee years. It goes back to the law, Leviticus 25, and the establishment of the Jubilee. Well, the Jubilee is based on the sabbatical cycles, and Moses is instructed by the Lord, when you shall come into the land, that is when the land shall begin to declare Sabbaths. 7 sevens of years, and in the space of 49 years, and then in the 50th year to declare Jubilee. And there were specific aspects that were associated with Jubilee: freedom of servants or those indentured slave servants, whatever. Land returning to rightful ownership. It was about restoration and liberty and things returning to rightful ownership and things like that. And that was the the Jubilee year in which all of that occurred in. So then there's a timeline. There's a method given to count, and there's a specific day of entry into the promised land given where this count starts. And that's given in Joshua 4, I believe it's Joshua 4:19, that the Israelites came up out of the Jordan and encamped in Gilgal in the 10th day of the first month. And then Joshua 5 goes on to discuss how all of the males that had come out of Israel, come out of the wilderness, had to be circumcised according to the law given in Exodus 12, that in order to partake of the Passover, all male Israelites had to be circumcised. So because all the ones that were circumcised to partake of the Passover that facilitated the Exodus died in the wilderness, the ones that were born in the wilderness and were of age to enter into the promised land at that time, 40 years later, had not been circumcised, and so they had to be circumcised in order to partake of the Passover 4 days later. And then on the 15th day of the month of Nisan, which would be the first day of the Feast of First Fruits, manna from heaven ceased. So that's kind of the timeline. So that's the beginning of the sabbatical cycles from the 10th day of the first month, and then there's a method given to count 7 sevens of years, and then the 50th year declared this Jubilee year. And this is consistent with Leviticus 25:10, not Leviticus 25:9. It's got nothing to do with the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement and the proclamation of Jubilee on the Day of Atonement related to Jesus, and Luke 4 related back to Isaiah 61, and it was the assumption of the role of the scapegoat and the declaration of Jubilee on the day of the beginning of his ministry and from that day forward. So Leviticus 25:9 on the Day of Atonement is tied to Jesus declaring Jubilee in Luke 4 related to Isaiah 61. Leviticus 25:10, which relates to the actual Jubilee year and not just the proclamation of Jubilee, begins on the 10th day of the first month, the month of Nisan, just like the sabbatical cycles were established in Joshua 4 when Israel entered the land. And that was the command given by God to Moses in Leviticus 5. When ye shall come into the land shall declare a Sabbath, count 6 years, and in the 7th year, all of that stuff. So there's a couple of different things going on here. However, because we have a method to count, you can establish or calculate Jubilee years into infinity, essentially, because it's current year plus 49 to get to year 50, and then keep going on and on and on. And then obviously there's no year 0, so you have to take that out when you're going from BC to AD, and then you just keep current year plus 49, plus 49, plus 49 to get to year 50. And this is a point of contention. People say, well, just add 50. Well, you can't, because you have to count the current year. If you add 50, then you're 51. And it's current year plus 49 to get to the 50th year. If you plot it all out, it makes perfect sense. It's much easier to see. So anyway, there are other data points on the timeline that I used, specifically the year of the construction of Solomon's temple, the year of the the destruction of Solomon's temple, the Exodus, the entry into the promised land. I think there were other ones. I think there was one more, and I can't remember what it is. But anyway, there were data points that are plotted that follow along these. And some of them are in Jubilee years, and some of them are not. Ezekiel was where I started, Ezekiel 40, verse 1. There are actually 3 different years that Ezekiel is pointing to. The first year of one of the captivities related to Babylon. He's like 25 years from something and 14 years from something else. And then so that points to the year he's in. And he's giving a prophecy for what will happen in another Jubilee year. His prophecy is also received on the 10th day of the first month in a Jubilee year, talking about another Jubilee year. So the problem that I ran into was thinking that what he was seeing was in the year of the second coming, because Ezekiel's vision covers Ezekiel 40 through 48. Well, Jesus comes back and sets foot in the temple to complete the final of the 6 purposes for the 70 weeks in Ezekiel 43:5. So yes, that is related to the second coming, and that is related to the fulfillment of the final purpose for the 70 weeks, pinpointed to Ezekiel 43:5. However, Ezekiel's vision begins with the construction of the temple. Now, it's referred to very broadly as the millennial temple, but it's not built in the millennium. And that's where I went wrong. I associated the year on the Jubilee timeline that I had established to the year of the second coming, but it doesn't belong to that. It belongs to the year of the construction of the temple, which is what Ezekiel's vision begins with. And this is where we have to continue going through the book of Joshua to find this out. Because through those 7 years, from the beginning of, well, okay. This is where when I wrote in the Spotlight Volume 2, The Nation Born at Once, which was my 7th book. So between the time I started the Jubilee research and, 6 books later to book 7, when I wrote about the nation born at once, I wrote in depth about the different temples, because Isaiah 66 begins with the Lord asking, "Where is the house that you build unto me? Where is the place of my rest?" Well, what temple is he going to rest in? Ezekiel's millennial temple. He's going to rule and reign from it. Ezekiel 43 tells us all about that. However, Ezekiel 43 also tells us that it will be standing when he comes back. He doesn't build it when he comes back. There's a lot of people who think that it's going to descend from heaven, or that Jesus is going to build it when he comes back. And it's not. Ezekiel 43 tells us who is going to build it and why they're going to build it. It goes back to Isaiah 66 also, which tells us that at this temple where Jesus is eventually going to rule and reign from, that they're going to offer abominable sacrifices at it. Why would they do that? Because it's also the tribulation temple. And that is why Revelation 11 says, "Rise and measure the temple of God." It's very interesting to note that language, because if the temple that they build in the 70th week, that they'll do the sacrifices and the reinstitution of the sacrificial system, and the one that will have the daily sacrifices and offering cut off from, if God is to have no association with it, and obviously the sacrificial system does not please him because it disregards his son as the final sacrifice for sin. I went through all of this in great detail, and I will be sure to bring it up. But why then would it be called the temple of God? We go back to the Gospels, and at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, he referred to the temple as my Father's house. But in Matthew 23, which is the chapter just before the Olivet Discourses, Matthew 24 and 25 is the same Olivet Discourse, and he talks about it's 70th week specific, leading up to judgment. And then when Jesus comes back, Matthew 25 is when he comes back, the judgment that is actually rendered. But in the chapter that precedes that, he pronounces woes upon the religious leaders. And he says, "Behold, your house shall be left unto you desolate." So what happened to go from calling it my Father's house to calling it your house? God would have no further association to it after the Jews rejected Jesus, which happened in Matthew 21. That was the cutoff point. That was the first offering of the kingdom. They rejected it. The whole of Israel did not accept it. It served as a rejection. It was taken off of the table, delayed to a second coming. So then because the first order of business, when Jesus bowed his head and gave up the ghost, the veil of the temple would be rent in twain from top to bottom, signaling that the way into the holy place had changed. New law, new covenant, new high priest, new everything. The physical temple, the need for the physical temple went away. The need for the earthly priesthood went away because our high priest is from the tribe of Judah, not from the tribe of Levi. The way into the holy place or to God, the mediation changed through Christ to God rather than through the high priest to God on the Day of Atonement and things like that. The whole thing changed. So why then, if that temple, which was the second temple, went from being called my Father's house to your house shall be left unto you desolate? God claimed no ownership of it whatsoever. Why then does he go back in Revelation 11 to when this temple is going to be constructed? Why then is there a return, knowing that it's going to reinstitute a sacrificial system that disregards Christ as the final sacrifice for sin? That they're going to resume an old covenant relationship that cannot save them, that Isaiah 1 says God hates. And Isaiah 66 calls abominable. God calls abominable. Why then is the temple once again referred to as the house of God? Rise and measure the temple of God. Why then? Because the tribulation temple is the same as the millennial temple. It is Ezekiel's temple. Ezekiel 38 and 39 are Gog and Magog. Ezekiel 40 is the construction of the temple, Ezekiel 40 through 42. So the problem with my research was that I thought that this point in time that Ezekiel receives this vision, which is in a Jubilee year, prophesying of what will happen in another Jubilee year, I linked it to the second coming. It didn't belong linked to the second coming. It belonged linked to the event which it was actually describing in that chapter and through chapter 42, the construction of the temple, which is Revelation 11's temple, which happens at the beginning of the 70th week. There are still 7 more years that will elapse between Ezekiel 40 and 42 and Ezekiel 43 when Jesus sets foot in the temple to accomplish the last of the 6 purposes for the 70 weeks. Now, where this goes back to Joshua is that the sabbatical cycles begin to be counted when they come into the land. That happens, that's right. But they warred for Canaan, conquest of Canaan for 7 years. Joshua 12 or Joshua 11, I believe 11:18 is where it said, and the land rested from war. And then the whole rest of the book is talking about the parceling of land to the 12 tribes, according to what Moses had been told in Deuteronomy. Well, what happens at the end of Ezekiel? The parceling of land to the 12 tribes. That is what happens in chapter 47 and 48, or at least 48. That is the very last order of business in the book of Ezekiel, is the parceling of land to the 12 tribes in the millennial kingdom. At the end of that, from the time the temple is constructed, again, Ezekiel 40 and 42, which will happen at the beginning of the 70th week, which is what that Jubilee year is linked to. Again, not the second coming. It's the event 7 years prior, which will see Israel build the temple of the Lord because they are ashamed and contrite. And that is the instruction given in Ezekiel 43. They will not understand what time period they are in. They will believe themselves to be in a time period they are not actually in. And this will be why they do what they do for the one who comes in the place of Christ, believing that this is what they're supposed to do when he comes back so that he can dwell with them forever. Read the chapter of Ezekiel 43 and you will understand this. This is why Israel does what they do, because of Ezekiel 43. And it says, if you be ashamed of all you have done, measure the house, measure the form of the house, the pattern of the house, the goings into the house, the comings out of the house, all of the house, and build it. Jesus doesn't build the temple, doesn't build the millennial temple. The people do it. And they do it because they are ashamed and contrite of what they have done. On the heels of Gog and Magog, when as a unifying event, Israel comes to a knowledge that the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob exists, and he is fully sovereign and on their side, and they desire to come back to him, but it's not in a new covenant relationship. It's in an old covenant relationship, which is why they build the temple and reinstitute the sacrificial system and reinstitute the priesthood and all of that stuff related to the old covenant, which is what the covenant in Daniel's time was. It wasn't an old covenant at that time because there was not yet a new covenant. It was just the covenant. Hebrews 18 makes this clear, and saying, new, he hath made the first old. Now that which is old is, now that waxeth old, something. I don't have my Bible in front of me. But until there's a new, then the old isn't old. It's just the covenant. So in Daniel's time, that's what existed, and that's what he will confirm. And so Ezekiel 40 through 42 tells us what will occur in this specific year. It's the building of the temple, and that corresponds to Revelation 11. So that's what the Jubilee timeline pointed to in the year. Not the second coming, the construction of the temple. It points to the first year of the 70th week. So 7 years later, when Jesus actually comes back at the end of the 70th year, or 70th week, sorry, that's Ezekiel 43 through 48. Tells us all the stuff that will happen in the millennial kingdom. The last chapter of which is the parceling of the land to the 12 tribes. Just like after they came into the land in Joshua, and they established the sabbatical cycles, and they celebrated the Passover, which is when the covenant will be confirmed with the Antichrist, the Passover sacrifice. Covenant confirmation, just like in the New Testament with Jesus' death and shed blood on the cross to bring in the new covenant, the old covenant was also confirmed or established with death and bloodshed. That is how covenants are confirmed in the law, is with death and bloodshed. And even the new covenant, death and bloodshed. That is what will commence the 70th week, is death and bloodshed, the Passover sacrifice. That is what will commence the 70th week. And Israel is going to be all on board. They're going to rebuild their temple, institute the rest of the sacrificial system, and Ezekiel 46, either 45 or 46. It might even be 47. I can't remember. I'll go through all of this. But it tells us why this Antichrist, the one who comes in the place of Christ, will be able to cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Because the prince, who he is referred to in Daniel, the prince, as Ezekiel says, is responsible for offering the sacrifices on specific days, including feast days. That is how he is able to cause them to cease, because he is going to be required to offer them on that day. And by simply not doing it, he causes it to cease. There's a whole lot of stuff that Ezekiel talks about that you can match up with Daniel's prophecy. Well, Daniel 12, the very last thing that we're told after Daniel 12 begins with talking about the war in heaven, which is Revelation 12, and the last half of the 70th week. It gives us a specific day count. It'll be time times half a time till all these things be fulfilled. And then at the end, which is Revelation, links to Revelation 19, Jesus coming back, the second coming. Then at the end of Daniel, we're given extra day counts, that there is an extra 30 days to this and an extra 45 days till this. And at the end of the days, Daniel will stand in his lot. The lots are parceled to the 12 tribes in Ezekiel 48. That's what that corresponds to. Just like in Joshua, they came into the land declared a Sabbath, they started counting the sabbatical cycles, but there was a conquest for Canaan for 7 years. Israel is going to come into the land, and they're going to do all this stuff, thinking that they're in a time period that they're not, and there's going to be war in Jerusalem for 7 years. And then at the end of that 7 years, Jesus is going to come back and fight on their behalf and put an end to all of that. and establish his righteous kingdom on earth, an age of peace. Just like in Joshua 11:18 or 19, where it says, and the land rested from war. And what did they do right after that? Divided up the land according to the lots by tribe. And that's exactly what Ezekiel talks about, is after Jesus comes back and puts an end to the war and establishes his kingdom in righteousness, he's going to divide up the land by lot according to tribe for Israel. So Daniel and Joshua and Ezekiel are really the keys to this Jubilee timeline. And it wasn't so much that I had it wrong, as that it was, I did have the ending point wrong. I had the wrong event that I was linking that Jubilee year to. It's the construction of the temple, not the second coming. Add 7 to get to the year of the second coming. So again, some people aren't going to be happy because, like, well, what about the rapture? The rapture can happen anytime. You're telling us it's not going to happen for years? I'm telling you that there's a year in view for Ezekiel's vision, and it's on the timeline, and there are a couple of possibilities depending on which year things happened, which year Israel entered the promised land, 1406, 1407, 1405, whatever. So, there's a little bit of wiggle room there, just because I don't know which year these things happen. But your target, it's only going to shift a possibility of a couple of years depending on which years these things happen. Again, there's a set of data points which must correspond, which means that if one shifts, all of them must shift. And so the probability of being able to move that stuff multiple years, it diminishes, because there's a year that Solomon's temple was built. There's a year that Solomon's temple was destroyed. There's a year that Israel exited the promised land, or exited Egypt. There's a year that Israel entered the promised land. There's a year that, and there's something with 360. It's like First Chronicles 6:1 or Second Chronicles 6:1. Couple of different years, Solomon's, and Ezekiel's got 3 different years, the different exiles, Babylon. You can't shift everything indefinitely. And that was the problem that I came to the first time, was not understanding like how all of this stuff, all of these years could be right for these events, and then it's still not work out right. Well, it's because the end point was wrong. The end point doesn't go to the second coming. It goes to the year that Ezekiel got the vision is a Jubilee year. And the year that he's prophesying about is a Jubilee year also. And the first 3 chapters of what he begins to prophesy about are the Ezekiel's temple. And so the key to understanding what year he's talking about and what event that's going to correspond to is knowing when that temple is going to be rebuilt and for what purpose. Not at the second coming. It's the tribulation temple, which puts it 7 years before the second coming. You have to add 7, just like the conquest of Canaan in Joshua. And at the end of that 7 years, the land rests from war, Jesus comes back, and then the land is partial to the 12 tribes. So there's, Ecclesiastes tells us there's nothing new under the sun. And I just didn't go far enough in my research. And I will be doing that. I will be completing that. So I will represent all of that, but I just kind of wanted to let you guys know what I'm going to be working on and give you a little bit more information about that. Ezekiel 40 through 48 are fascinating chapters, and much more about Daniel's prophecies makes sense when you compare them against Ezekiel. A lot more makes sense. And then the book of history, Joshua, that is where the sabbatical cycles start, and that helps us understand that additional 7 years at the end, and how that stuff matches up. So those are really the 3 books that I'm going to be focused on. So I'm going to tweak my research and go through all of that. But light the sky, O God, good evening to you as well. So according to your study, when will Israel build the temple, the 3rd temple? In a few years. If it's the tribulation temple, then we can hypothesize on the timing of the rapture. Yes. So the covenant that the Antichrist confirms is the Mosaic covenant. Yes. Not some treaty that was granting peace with Israel and her neighbors. No, absolutely not. It is a religious covenant. And it can't be a peace treaty by virtue of the fact that the second rider on the horse, Revelation 6, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. First rider on the rider on the white horse, first seal broken first seal opened in Revelation 6 is the rider on the white horse, the Antichrist, the one who comes in the place of Christ. Second seal is the red horse, given a great mighty sword to take peace from the earth. So if your covenant's a peace treaty, it would be broken immediately, because taking peace from the earth is not just on a national or international level or a people versus people, country versus country, nation versus nation. It's essentially everyone out for themselves. It's not going to be peaceful conditions at all, ever, from the very beginning of the 70th week. And we learn that from the get-go, seal 2. So when that's open, it takes peace from the earth. I don't know how that could work out if it was a peace treaty, but no, it's a religious covenant. And it's got to do with, that's why there's a temple rebuilt and a reinstitution of the sacrificial system and all of that. The whole purpose of Gog and Magog is to unify Israel. Right now, Israel would not do anything as one. Israel is as divided as any other country. And you see that as they can't even elect leadership because they're so divided right now. So there's no way that they would do anything together in the current circumstance. Gog and Magog is a unifying event. It serves to show Israel that their God exists and to unite them in purpose toward something. Now, the first thing that they're going to be united in purpose toward is, obviously, they know their God exists, and they're going to, according to Isaiah 66 and Ezekiel 43, be contrite and ashamed for all that they've done and wish to please their God. And so they're going to institute what they believe is the way to do that, which is the old covenant. They build their temple, reinstitute their sacrificial system, and honor their God that way. But he calls them abominations because these sacrifices, Hebrews 10 talks about this, Isaiah 1, Isaiah 66, lots of places, that God has no pleasure in the blood of bulls and goats because they cannot take away sin. He had pleasure in the sacrifice of Christ, which Isaiah 53, the suffering servant chapter, talks about. It was pleasing to him that Christ died on behalf of the sins of the world, because that was the only sacrifice that could and did take away sin. So their reinstitution of all of that stuff, it continues to reject Christ. But they don't understand that. They're just trying to please their God, get back to their God. And they're going to do this as one. The first thing they will do as one is confirm the covenant with who they believe their Messiah to be. He shall confirm the covenant with many. Many is a reference to Israel for 1 week. So the only way that Israel is going to do something together is if they're unified. That is the purpose of Gog and Magog, is to unify Israel. Now, they're not doing the right thing, but 7 years later, they will, as one, do the right thing. And that is documented in the book of Joel chapter 2, and Jeremiah chapter 4. Those are the most in-detail descriptions. And that will be their acceptance of Christ, which will bring them into the new covenant. And immediately, Jesus will come back, because they will do that literally at the last second. So, yes, it's the covenant that Daniel speaks of in Daniel 9:27 is a confirmation of the old covenant. And that is why the temple will be rebuilt. And that is what the point in time on the Jubilee timeline that I was working with originally should have pointed to, was the construction of the temple, specifically Ezekiel's temple, which also will be the tribulation temple. And I discussed how that must be the case in my 7th book, Isaiah 66. It was in the Spotlight Volume 2, Isaiah 66. The Nation Born at Once talked all about that, how that must be the case, where it's going to be built, why it's going to be built, all of that. So kind of didn't click on the Jubilee timeline thing because that wasn't on my mind at the time. That is what Ezekiel's vision pointed to, that the year that he was in receiving this vision and pointing to another year when this will occur was not the second coming. Although the rest of his prophecy does discuss from chapter 43 through 48, this does discuss what will happen when Jesus returns and into the millennial kingdom. But the temple is not built in the millennial kingdom. It's built 7 years prior at the beginning of the 70th week. And that is why Revelation 11 calls the tribulation temple, which you never see destroyed, calls it the temple of God. Rise and measure the temple of God. Why is the tribulation temple called the temple of God? Because it is going to be Ezekiel's temple, and it is going to be based on Ezekiel 43, where Jesus will rule and reign from and set foot on the ground in and all of that stuff. He will rule and reign from for that 1,000-year period. And that is why it's called the temple of God. He won't have anything to do with it for the first 7 years. But after that, when Jesus comes back, it is the one that will be standing for him to march down from the Mount of Olives, or march into from the Mount of Olives and through the eastern gate and fill it with his glory, which is the final purpose for the 70 weeks, is to anoint the most holy. And again, we see that in Ezekiel 43:5. So that is what I had wrong and how I intend to clarify it. So I have a lot of the research already done, and I just have to kind of compile it and tweak some stuff. And there will be additional explanation. I'm just not sure how much additional explanation I'll give. But once I start writing, I'll know. But the answers to all of that really lie with Ezekiel 40 through 48 to tell us what time period will be when those things will happen. And Ezekiel 40 through 42, 7 years apart from Ezekiel 43 through 48. And that is because the temple is built at the beginning of the 70th week, because Israel will believe themselves to be in a time period they are not in. And then 7 years later, when Jesus comes back, that is what will be standing when he marches into it and accomplishes, again, the final purpose for the 70 weeks. So wasn't all wrong, just the end point was wrong by 7 years. So if all of that was correct, I had because my sabbatical cycle stuff was off too a little bit. So I just need to go back through it and revise, because I've learned a little bit of the differentiation between the Leviticus 25 stuff since I wrote that. Again, it was written going on 4 years ago. So a lot of study, a lot of learning and stuff that's happened since then. So its bones are good, but it just needs some help. Hopefully that all made sense. I invite you guys to question, comment, feedback, any of that, all of that. But that is what I'm going to be working on, and hopefully I will have that done sooner rather than later. It's a few years off still, but it's not as far as it was away yesterday or even 4 years ago when I wrote the book. So, it'll happen one of these days. Can we figure it out? And that's another thing that I'm going to have to address is I feel like I have to mention stuff for the naysayers. We can't know the day or the hour. We're not going to know, whatever. The Bible doesn't say that. In fact, it gives us the information. We just have to discern it. And is that possible? Maybe, maybe not. But if I didn't think that it was, I wouldn't be spending my time doing it. Obviously, I think that it is, and for good reason. The Bible does not tell us that information is unknowable. And if people are dissuaded from studying it because they think it's unknowable, then this just might not be for them. But for those who are interested in potentially learning, then maybe it's for you, to each their own. But if I didn't think it was knowable, or if the Bible told us it wasn't, then I wouldn't be studying this. But I absolutely believe that it is. And So yeah, that's pretty much all I have, unless anybody here has any questions for me. But otherwise, I will get to work. Hopefully this weekend I will start on it. And yeah, pretty much all I had. So I'll call it a night. Appreciate you guys and your time to watch this, listen to this. But if you do have any questions, I would appreciate you, asking or letting me know, and I will answer to the best of my ability. But I wish you guys a good evening and a happy Friday tomorrow and a good weekend. So take care, and I'll see you guys later.